Buying a mattress today feels less like shopping and more like applying for a mortgage on a rectangle. Memory foam, cooling gel, orthopedic support, pressure relief, temperature control, a 100-night trial, and somehow a pillow that costs more than a goat. But for most of human history, none of this existed. There were no mattress stores, no bed frames, no fitted sheets, no carefully engineered layers of foam. So how did ancient humans sleep? Did they simply collapse onto the ground at sunset and hope nothing decided to eat them before sunrise? The answer is much more interesting than that, because for ancient humans, sleep was never just about comfort. It was a dangerous period when you stopped watching the environment, stopped reacting quickly, and became completely vulnerable. Before humans could invent a comfortable bed, they first had to invent something much more important, a way to sleep without becoming someone else's dinner. For millions of years, one of the safest places for a sleeping primate was above the ground. Many living apes still build sleeping platforms in trees, carefully bending branches together and arranging leaves into a surprisingly stable nest. It's basically custom furniture, except the customer is also the construction worker, and the entire bedroom is attached to a tree. For smaller primates, sleeping above the ground makes obvious sense. Height can reduce contact with many predators, insects, damp soil, and other nighttime hazards. But as our ancestors became larger, more terrestrial, and increasingly adapted to walking upright, sleeping high in trees became less practical. A heavy-bodied hominin trying to balance on a branch while unconscious is less like peaceful sleep, and more like an extremely dangerous accident waiting to happen. The ground was easier. It was closer to water, food, fire, tools, and the rest of the group. But it came with a serious problem. The ground was also where predators moved. So once our ancestors began spending more time sleeping on the ground, they had to find ways to make that environment safer. This is where fire changed everything. Fire provided warmth, light, smoke, and a barrier between the human group and the darkness beyond it. It also changed what nighttime meant. Instead of disappearing completely after sunset, people could remain active around the flames. They could cook, repair tools, care for children, communicate, and watch the surrounding darkness. A fire did not make the night harmless, but it gave humans something incredibly valuable, a small area of the world that they could control. And humans didn't have to control it alone. Sleeping close to other members of the group created another layer of protection. One person might hear something outside the shelter, while another was still awake. Someone might notice a change in the fire. Someone else might respond to a crying child. Humans naturally have different sleep patterns too. Some people stay awake later, while others wake earlier. Children, adults, and older people don't all sleep in exactly the same way. So an entire group probably didn't become completely unconscious at the same moment every night. There was no prehistoric security guard standing beside the fire with a schedule. But natural differences in sleep could have created periods when at least some members of the group remained alert. Once humans had fire, shelter, and other people around them, they could begin solving another problem: comfort. Because the ground is surprisingly terrible at being a mattress. Bare soil absorbs heat from the body. Stone creates pressure points. Damp surfaces make everything colder. And somehow, the exact rock you didn't notice while standing becomes the one sitting directly underneath your spine when you're trying to sleep. So early humans began changing the surface beneath their bodies. Dry grass was softer than bare soil. Leaves added insulation. Reeds could create a thicker, springier layer. Animal hides could separate the body from the cold ground. The first bed probably wasn't invented by one person having a sudden brilliant idea. It was probably created through thousands of small observations made by tired people who simply noticed what felt better. Someone discovered that dry vegetation was warmer. Someone noticed that certain plants made a softer surface. Someone learned that a sheltered corner stayed drier. Someone else realized that old bedding could simply be removed and replaced. These tiny discoveries could be remembered and passed to other people.
And once useful knowledge becomes shared knowledge, it starts becoming technology. Humans didn't need to understand insulation, thermodynamics, or pest control. They only needed to recognize that one sleeping place was better than another. But bedding created another problem. A pile of vegetation used night after night would eventually collect sweat, dirt, food particles, shed skin, moisture, and insects. To a human,
The evidence becomes even more fascinating because researchers also identified fragments of aromatic plants. Some plants in this group contain chemicals known to repel insects. We cannot say with certainty that ancient humans deliberately placed them there to keep insects away. They may have been used as fuel or may simply have entered the bedding accidentally. Archaeology rarely gives us a complete instruction manual. But the possibility is fascinating because it shows how much prehistoric humans may have understood about their environment simply through observation. They didn't need to know why a plant worked. They only needed to know that sleeping near it seemed to produce fewer unwanted visitors. At Sibudu Cave, also in southern Africa, the evidence becomes even clearer. Around 77,000 years ago, people were constructing bedding from grasses and leafy plants. Some of these layers included aromatic leaves containing compounds that may have helped repel insects. Later layers show evidence that bedding was repeatedly burned, possibly as part of routine camp maintenance. Think about what that means. People were not simply throwing some grass onto the floor once and forgetting about it. They were repeatedly preparing their sleeping environment. Old material was destroyed. Fresh material was brought in. The surface was renewed. Fire was being used as part of domestic life. Nobody was fluffing decorative pillows, but the basic idea of maintaining a sleeping space was already there. Of course, archaeology has limits. Grass disappears, wood rots, animal hides decay. Organic materials are constantly destroyed by time, moisture, insects, and fire. So when archaeologists find plant bedding, they're seeing only a fraction of what once existed. Ancient humans may have used hides, wooden structures, woven materials, raised platforms, or other sleeping technologies that simply didn't survive. And different environments would have demanded different solutions. Someone living in a warm, tropical region did not need exactly the same sleeping surface as someone surviving an Ice Age winter. There probably was never one universal prehistoric bed. There were countless local solutions to the same basic problem. How do you safely become unconscious? The same caution applies when we try to imagine how ancient humans actually slept. It's tempting to picture everyone falling asleep immediately after sunset and waking with the sunrise. But human sleep is much more complicated than that. Sleep depends on temperature, season, latitude, artificial light, daily work, social behavior, and cultural habits. Historical societies much later in time sometimes describe people having a first period of sleep, waking during the night, and then returning to sleep. But that doesn't prove prehistoric humans universally followed the same pattern. A group living near the equator would have experienced a very different night from people living through a freezing winter thousands of years ago. Some groups may have remained awake around the fire for hours before sleeping, while others may have slept at different times depending on work, children, weather, or danger. What does seem clear is that sleep was never purely an individual activity. Once humans began living and sleeping in groups, nighttime became a social environment. During the day, people were spread across the landscape, hunting, gathering, traveling, building, and working. After dark, everyone became concentrated around the fire and shelter. That created time for communication. People could teach children, share information, plan the next day, discuss dangers, and tell stories. And those stories may have been much more important than simple entertainment. In a world without books or written instructions, stories were a way of storing information inside human memory. A story about a dangerous animal could teach children what to avoid. A story about a river could preserve knowledge about where water could be found. A story about someone who ignored strange tracks could become a lesson that survived long after the original event. The sleeping environment also brought people physically closer together. In cold conditions,
Staying close could reduce heat loss. Children could sleep beside adults. Injured members of the group could remain protected. Someone waking in the darkness didn't have to search through an empty landscape for help. The people they trusted were nearby. A child could wake and find an adult's arm within reach. An injured person could call for assistance. A fire could be maintained because everyone depended on it. These simple arrangements may have strengthened cooperation because survival during the night depended on other people. And that may be the most important part of the entire story. The greatest invention wasn't the grass mattress. It wasn't the ash. It wasn't even the fire. It was trust. Every time an ancient human closed their eyes beside another person, they were...
Even insomnia has an ancient echo. The human brain was never designed to switch off like a computer. It constantly monitors temperature, noise, hunger, discomfort, social tension, and possible danger. Sometimes that vigilance protects us. Sometimes it wakes us at 3:17 in the morning because the brain suddenly decides that now is the perfect moment to replay an embarrassing conversation from 8 years ago. Evolution doesn't always optimize for convenience. It optimizes for survival. And the story of ancient sleep reveals something else that is easy to forget. Comfort did not suddenly appear when civilization invented mattresses. Humans had been improving their sleeping environments for an incredibly long time. A softer plant, a drier patch of ground, a better shelter, a warmer fire, a useful aromatic leaf, a fresh layer of grass. Each improvement was tiny, but together they transformed the ground itself into a human-made environment. So ancient humans did not really sleep without beds. They slept without modern beds. They didn't have mattress stores or memory foam or cooling gel. They didn't compare firmness ratings or return a mattress after 90 nights because their lower back wasn't impressed. They simply used what the environment gave them: grass, leaves, hides, ash, fire, shelter, and each other. And when you think about it, that is an astonishing achievement. Every night, you close your eyes and trust the world enough to become completely vulnerable for several hours. Your ancestors had to build that trust with firelight, plant fibers, shelter, and cooperation. They transformed dangerous darkness into a place where a human could finally let their guard down. And that ancient sleeping surface eventually became the mattress beneath you today. So the next time you lie down and complain that your mattress is too firm, your pillow is too flat, or the temperature isn't exactly right, remember where this entire story began. It didn't begin in a furniture store. It didn't begin with memory foam. It didn't begin with a luxury bedroom. It began with an exhausted human looking at a patch of grass and realizing one incredibly simple thing: sleeping on this is probably better than sleeping on a rock. And somehow, hundreds of thousands of years later, we're still trying to improve the same idea.